Well, how you doing, Mr. DJ? Back number 10 on my fantasy playlist countdown of August 10th, 1985. Excuse me. Just getting started, getting my engines warmed up. Always started cold. Sometimes on these nights, it takes a few minutes to get the engines warmed up and just revved up and get going. Huey Lewis and the News, The Power of Love at number 10. I don't even know where to start. I, Here's the deal. Now, listen hear me out on this. Back in the 60s, it wasn't cool to be over 30. Most of the rock stars were under 30 in the 60s. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Supremes, Jimi Hendrix, they're all in their 20s. Youthfulness and rock and roll in the 60s. But you get into the 80s as rock and roll becomes more mainstream, and it's crystallized in my head. How many people, Phil Collins, Lionel Richie, Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, and I'm sure there are some others, who they were in their 30s in the 80s and they reached their commercial prime. Bruce Springsteen was 35, 34, 35 when he came out with Dancing in the Dark, the Born in the USA album. And it's interesting how, and these artists, they grew up in the 50s. They grew up in the late 50s, the early to mid 60s, and came of age in the late 60s and early 70s. Huey Lewis, another older guy, I guess older comparatively speaking, in his 30s, at his commercial prime. Huey Lewis in the News. It's just astonishing how many of the mainstream artists who got really big, not only they appealed to teenagers and young adults, but they also appealed, particularly Lionel Richie and Huey Lewis, they appealed to the older people too, well, the 35 to 40 to 45-year-olds. Now, this age group in the 80s, they were not into Twisted Sister. They're not into LL Cool J. They're not into the heavy dance music of the 80s. But mainstream artists like John Cougar Mellencamp, Huey Lewis, Lionel Richie, Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson, who turned 30 in 1988. And these artists had appealed to this older age group. I had to get that off my chest. Huey Lewis and the News, they were not an innovative band by any means. They were not the genius band that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were. They did not go off into imperfect, I can't pronounce the word. They were not like the progressive bands. They didn't hit the creative heights of the progressive bands of the late 60s and early 70s, like Yes, Jethro Tull, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Traffic, even some of the other bands like Leonard Skinner. But they were tight. The choruses were catchy. The songs were just stuffed full of hooks. They churned out one radio-friendly record after another. And two of their albums, Sports was real big. That was in '83, and there was 11 top 10 hits between those two albums. Power of Love, their first #1 hit from the movie Back to the Future. And that was a cool movie. I watched that movie at the Tide Theater, right here in Tuscaloosa, summer of '85. Huey Lewis and the News, Power of Love, that was a huge record that summer. Huey Lewis started as a band called Clover back in the early 70s. Huey Lewis and there was another guy, Sean Hopper, a keyboard player, joined the band in 1972. Clover put out some albums in the 70s, and they moved to England and became part of the pub rock scene. But Huey Lewis also performed a little bit with Thin Lizzy for a while. Then they relocated to the Bay Area. Now, Huey Lewis had competition in the Bay Area from a band called Soundhole. In 1978, Huey Lewis, the band, Will Clover, and some of the members from Soundhole, they combined. And they called themselves Huey Lewis and the American Express. They released a disco record, didn't do anything. And their manager, Bob Brown, former manager of Pablo Cruz, said, we got to drop that name. we're going to run into some copyright issues or some major issues calling yourself American Express. So they became Huey Lewis and the News. First big hit was in the spring of '82, Do You Believe in Love, which was, I just found out that song was written by Mutt Lange, the guy who produced albums by Def Leppard, Aerosmith, and Shania Twain. Boy, that guy, he was everywhere back in the '80s and '90s, big time. Mutt Lange. Anyway, Back to the Future, starring Michael J. Fox. Remember the part, I'll never forget this, remember the part in the movie, Michael J. Fox, he threw down on that guitar. He was playing Chuck Berry, and then he went off into Jimi Hendrix. Now, we're talking about back in the '50s. He just completely freaked the crowd out. They're like, what the hell are you doing? And he was kind of laughed it off. He said, well, your children will love this, as far as the Jimi Hendrix part is concerned. That was a cool part of the movie. One other thing, and I don't want you to quote me on this. I found out from a source that Alex Call was, I guess he was the original lead singer of Clover. Now, this is the guy who wrote Jenny, 8675309, which was done by Tommy Tutone back in the spring of '82. But I could not find any, but I didn't see that information. I didn't see his name mentioned on Wikipedia, so I'm not too sure, but I do have it down on my notes about Alex Call, but I could be wrong about that. The thing about Huey Lewis, one of his appeals to the more adult crowd was that he seemed like a clean-cut guy. I mean, he just a regular guy. But Huey Lewis later admitted that he wasn't quite as clean as he appeared. He smoked a lot of marijuana back in his time, smoked a lot of pot back in his time. Of course, a lot of people did, particularly rock stars back in the day. But Huey Lewis and the News, there was something else I wanted to say, and I just couldn't. Oh, God. Heart and Soul, one of their best. The blazing electric guitar riff. Down, 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 down. Now, that was some self-assurance. That guitar riff, it signals self-assurance. That was their way of saying, hey, we've come into our own. We're good and we know we're good. Check out this riff. Man, that's great. Favorite song by Huey Lewis and the News? Personal favorite, Jacob's Ladder. They mentioned Birmingham, Alabama. Yes, 1986. But let's go ahead and finish up this video. Huey Lewis and the News, The Power of Love at number 10 on my fantasy playlist of August 10th, 1985.